A warm Georgia morning, sunlight glinting off rows of freshly built luxury homes. The neighborhood looks like something out of a magazine. Smooth asphalt roads, manicured lawns, elegant porches lined with hanging flower baskets, and the sound of moving trucks rumbling softly as families settle into their brand new lives. Children laugh as they chase each other across perfect green yards, and proud homeowners take selfies in front of soldy signs. To everyone watching, this is the American dream fully realized, a thriving, exclusive community called Cedar Pines. But beneath the calm suburban surface, a storm was brewing. One man stood quietly on the edge of it all, hands in his pockets, watching the 120 homes rise higher and higher, brick by brick, on land that had carried the weight of his family's history for over a century. His name was Darnell Hayes. At 52, Darnell was a quiet man by nature, the kind who chose his words carefully and preferred listening over speaking. To the Cedar Pines Homeowners Association, he was a nobody, just another landowner sitting on a news property, someone they thought they could outsmart, pressure, and ultimately erase. But what they didn't know was that Darnell had been waiting for this exact moment for decades, and the trap had already been set. For months, glossy brochures had been mailed out by Cedar Pines HOA, promising buyers a piece of modern Southern luxury. The land they were advertising, Darnell's land, was described as prime, fully cleared, and ready for development. But what wasn't in the brochure was the truth: the land wasn't theirs to sell. Darnell's great-great-grandfather, a freedman named Elijah Hayes, had purchased those 80 acres in 1867, scraping together what little he had after emancipation to secure a piece of Georgia soil where his children, grandchildren, and their children could one day thrive. Elijah built a small house there, planted crops, and raised a family that would endure through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and generations of systemic efforts to strip them of what was rightfully theirs. Over the years, Darnell had watched developer after developer circle the property like vultures. They made offers, laughably low ones, always assuming the Hayes family would eventually give in. When Darnell refused, the tactics shifted. Suddenly, there were unexpected zoning adjustments. Then came the property tax hikes designed to squeeze him financially. He endured countless meetings where he was pressured to sign away unused land for the greater good of the community. And when that didn't work, they tried intimidation, threatening eminent domain, waving legal papers in his face, and insisting his family's deed had expired. Darnell never yelled. He never stormed out. Instead, he smiled politely, shook their hands, and went home to read. For 30 years, Darnell quietly studied property law, deed covenants, and historical land claims. He spent nights at the county records office, digging through yellowing archives and handwritten registries, piecing together the legal puzzle everyone else had overlooked. And somewhere in those dusty stacks, he found the key: a buried deed covenant from 1894, a small, almost forgotten clause requiring any future transfer of the Hayes property to be approved and signed by a living Hayes descendant. Without that signature, any sale, construction, or transfer on that land would be legally invalid. So when Cedar Pines OA approached Darnell in 2018, promising him a generous payout for his family's land, he told them calmly, "This isn't for sale." They ignored him. They went ahead with their $85 million development plan, bulldozing his family's soil and laying the foundation for 120 homes without his consent. And Darnell, he didn't protest. He didn't sue to stop them. He didn't block a single bulldozer. Because while they thought they were outsmarting him, he was watching and waiting. When the last roof was nailed, the last driveway paved, and the last SLD sign hammered into the earth, Darnell knew the time had come. What the HOA didn't realize was that every single brick they laid, every single property they sold, was sinking deeper into his carefully crafted legal trap. And when he finally revealed it, everything they thought they owned would come crashing down. Darnell Hayes had always known that his family's land carried more than just soil and trees. It carried stories, struggles, and the unbroken will of generations. Long before Cedar Pines HOA even existed, before developers began carving up Georgia's outskirts into neatly packaged subdivisions, the Hayes family had worked this land, loved it, and bled for it. His great-great-grandfather, Elijah Hayes, was born into slavery but walked free after the Civil War with little more than his hands and determination. In 1867, Elijah scraped together what he could: wages from backbreaking farm labor, a few borrowed dollars, and favors from friends, and bought 80 acres of wild, untamed Georgia land. That purchase was more than property. It was survival. It was independence. It was the promise that, in a country stacked against them, his family would have at least one place that no one could take away. Over the years, Elijah built a small wooden house and cleared fields to grow corn and collard greens. He planted pecan trees that still shaded the land a century later. He raised children there, teaching them that land was power. And that power had to be protected. Through Reconstruction and Jim Crow, the Hayes family endured constant threats and harassment, but the land remained theirs. By the time Darnell was born in 1973, the house had been rebuilt twice, extended, and repaired so many times it stood as a living monument to everything his ancestors had survived. But the world around them changed. In the 1990s, big developers began creeping into the county, buying up family farms and transforming them into exclusive suburban communities. At first, Darnell thought nothing of it, until one morning he drove past a neighbor's farm and saw bulldozers tearing it apart. One by one, families who had owned their land for generations were being pushed out, replaced by cul-de-sacs and country clubs. It wasn't just economic progress, it was erasure. For years, Darnell watched the same pattern play out. At first, the developers came with charm and smiles. They made offers, big numbers on shiny papers, promising homeowners life-changing payouts. If that didn't work, the pressure came next. Suddenly, there were city-planned infrastructure upgrades and rezoning proposals that conveniently made staying on your land more expensive than leaving. Property taxes skyrocketed. Small legal notices slipped quietly into mailboxes, and HOAs began using technicalities to push families out. By the early 2000s, Darnell realized his family was becoming a target. The Hayes property was strategically located between two growing suburban developments, making it the last large open tract in the area. Cedar Pines HOA saw those 80 acres as their golden ticket, the perfect spot for a gated, high-end neighborhood they could market as luxury living in a historic setting. But Darnell wasn't like his neighbors who had sold under pressure. He remembered Elijah's lessons. Land is the only thing they can't make more of. Hold it, protect it. When the HOA sent their first offer, Darnell didn't even bother reading the number. He sent the papers back unsigned. That's when the fight turned quiet but relentless. Cedar Pines HOA began sending him formal development proposals, carefully written letters that sounded friendly but carried an edge of authority. When he refused, they tried another tactic, pushing for a zoning change that would have limited his ability to build anything on his own land, effectively forcing him to sell if he ever wanted to profit from it. Darnell fought them at every county meeting, showing up in a neatly pressed shirt, documents in hand, his voice steady and respectful as he opposed their motions. But while they were fighting him in public, he was digging in private. He spent long nights hunched over dusty records in the county archives, scanning century, old property ledgers, handwritten deeds, and obscure legal filings, and it was there, in a forgotten box labeled Historical Transfers, that he found the 1894 deed covenant, a small clause, buried in old handwriting, that stated the Hayes property could never be sold, subdivided, or transferred without the written consent of a direct Hayes descendant. Darnell understood immediately what it meant. As long as no Hayes signed away their rights, the land was legally locked. No matter how many offers the HOA made, no matter how many lawyers they hired without his signature, nothing they built on that soil would ever truly belong to them. From that moment on, his plan changed. Darnell stopped resisting openly. He stopped arguing at council meetings. When Cedar Pines announced in 2018 that they were breaking ground on an $85 million development of 120 luxury homes, he said nothing. When construction crews arrived, bulldozers roared, and surveyors marked boundaries, he stood silently at the edge of the field, hands in his pockets, just watching. Because now, he wasn't just defending his land, he was setting the stage. Every dollar they spent, every foundation they poured, and every home they sold without his consent was another step into the trap they didn't even know existed. The construction of Cedar Pines went up like clockwork. Roads were paved, streetlights installed, and model homes showcased to eager buyers who lined up with deposit checks in hand. Developers praised themselves in local newspapers, calling it the crown jewel of suburban progress. By late 2022, 120 luxury homes stood gleaming under the Georgia sun, each priced between $600,000 and $1.2 million. The HOA had spared no expense: private security gates, landscaped walking trails, and a clubhouse so lavish it looked like it belonged in a resort. To everyone else, it was a triumph. But to Darnell Hayes, it was a quiet countdown. He had warned them more than once, sending registered letters months before construction began, stating in writing that his family's property was protected by a binding deed covenant. Each letter was ignored. Their attorneys brushed him off, treating him like an obstacle rather than a legal threat. They believed his silence during construction meant surrender. They had no idea he was letting them build their empire on top of a trap, so deep they'd never crawl out. When the final SLD sign went up in front of the last home, Darnell made his move. On a crisp Monday morning, he walked into the Cedar Pines HOA headquarters, a glassy, modern building filled with cheerful realtors sipping lattes, carrying a slim black folder under his arm. Without raising his voice, he requested a meeting with the HOA board. Inside the conference room, developers and HOA officials gathered around a long oak table, still glowing with pride over their multi-million-dollar success. Darnell set the folder down and calmly slid out copies of the 1894 deed covenant, stamped and verified by the county clerk. He looked them in the eyes and spoke the words that would send shockwaves through the room. Every home you built here, every contract you signed, every deed you filed, is legally invalid. You built an entire neighborhood on land that was never yours to sell. At first they laughed, thinking it was a bluff. The HOA's lead attorney, a sharp-suited man named Richard Halbrook, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Mr. Hayes, with all due respect," he said smoothly, "this land was properly zoned, cleared, and transferred through the county's registrar. Our titles are clean. We've followed every legal protocol." Darnell stayed composed, tapping the highlighted section of the covenant. "Except this," he replied softly. "You can't transfer what you don't own. Without a Hayes signature, the deeds aren't worth the paper they're printed on." "And I never signed?" The room went silent. Halbrook's smirk faded as he skimmed the document, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. A junior board member whispered, "Is this real?" Another muttered, "This can't be happening." But it was real, devastatingly real. Without valid ownership, the HOA faced catastrophic consequences. Every homebuyer could sue for fraud. The banks financing the mortgages could demand repayment in full. The developers could be held liable for hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. Within 2 weeks, the dispute escalated into a full-scale courtroom battle. The HOA accused Darnell of setting them up and claimed he'd hidden the covenant to ambush them. But Darnell's attorney produced copies of the letters he'd sent before construction began, proving they'd been warned and chose to ignore him. The courtroom was packed with reporters, homeowners, and activists. What started as a simple property dispute had exploded into a national conversation about land theft, systemic exploitation, and racial injustice. As Darnell sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, the HOA's attorneys scrambled, their carefully built defense crumbling under the weight of history and evidence. Then came the bombshell moment. A county records officer testified under oath that Cedar Pines HOA had intentionally bypassed zoning approvals and failed to file required documentation acknowledging the Hayes family's property rights. In other words, they'd gambled everything on the assumption that Darnell wouldn't fight back. And they'd lost. The judge's ruling stunned the room. Cedar Pines HOA had 90 days to either pay Darnell full market value for every single home built on his land or face foreclosure proceedings and federal fraud investigations. The numbers were staggering. More than that a $95 million owed to Darnell, plus additional damages still under review. For Darnell, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was validation, for Elijah, for every Hayes who'd held onto the land, and for every black family whose property had been quietly stolen over generations. Yet, as reporters crowded him outside the courthouse, he said only one thing. They thought silence meant weakness. But silence can also mean patience. "My family waited 150 years for justice. Today, we got it. Man wins back land stolen over generations. HOA faces to 95M payout. Oh, for Darnell Hayes, though, the victory wasn't about the money. Yes, the settlement amount was life-changing, enough to ensure that his family would never struggle again. But standing on that same soil where his great-great-grandfather Elijah once planted pecan trees, Darnell felt the weight of something far greater than personal gain. This was about restoring dignity, history, and justice, not just for himself but for thousands of families like his. In the weeks after the ruling, homeowners in Cedar Pines were furious. Not at Darnell, but at the HOA and developers who had lied to them. Many of them had sunk their life savings into homes they now feared they could lose. Darnell understood their anger. He knew what it felt like to have your home threatened, your future uncertain, and your trust betrayed. Instead of seeking revenge, he worked with his lawyers to structure a settlement plan that protected the homeowners while holding the developers and HOA fully accountable. The media tried to paint him as either a villain or a hero, but Darnell refused to be either. In interviews, he spoke calmly, focusing not on his personal windfall, but on the bigger story behind it. A story hidden in America's past and buried in property records across the country. He began speaking openly about the long, ugly history of black land loss, how families like his were pressured, tricked, or forced into giving up property that had been rightfully theirs for generations. "I didn't just win for myself. Darnell told one reporter, standing beside the original 1867 deed his great-great-grandfather signed with trembling hands. I won for Elijah. I won for every black farmer who was lied to, cheated, and pushed off their land. And I won so the next Elijah won't have to fight this fight. That conviction led Darnell to create the Hayes Land Justice Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to helping families investigate historical property records, recover stolen deeds, and fight predatory developers. Within months, his case inspired similar legal battles across Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Carolinas. Calls and emails poured in from families who had nearly identical stories. Land that had been in their bloodlines for a century or more, quietly stripped away by zoning tricks, forged paperwork, or HOA overreach. Darnell worked tirelessly alongside historians, lawyers, and grassroots activists, helping families reclaim land or secure settlements for decades-old injustices. His story became a rallying point in a broader national conversation about systemic land theft and reparations. Congressional hearings were launched to investigate historical patterns of property dispossession, and lawmakers cited Darnell's case as a turning point. But even as his influence grew, Darnell remained grounded. On weekends, he walked the fields of his reclaimed property, often pausing beneath the oldest picken tree on the land, the one Elijah planted more than 150 years ago. Sometimes he'd bring his teenage son, Marcus, and daughter Lena, and tell them the same lesson Elijah passed down through generations. Land isn't just dirt. It's memory. It's power. It's freedom. Never forget that. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Darnell stood alone, holding Elijah's original deed in his hands. The land stretched out before him, quiet and endless, carrying the weight of everything his family had endured. He thought of the decades of threats, lowball offers, legal tricks, and broken promises. He thought of the neighbors who lost their land because no one had told them their rights. And then he thought of the fight still ahead. A fight bigger than Cedar Pines, bigger than Georgia, bigger than his own story. Looking out across the acres that had nearly been stolen, he whispered softly, almost to Elijah himself, "They tried to erase us, but we're still here." As the camera pans wide across the reclaimed land, the narration closes. For over 150 years, one family held on while the system tried to push them out. They waited. They endured. And when the time came, they rose. This isn't just one man's victory. It's a reminder. History doesn't forget, and neither should we.